Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is an AMD Radeon 6600 XT that I bought to review simply for the reason I was bored of not having any hardware to review. It seems to be one of the only cards that has constantly been in stock for the past few weeks here in the UK, albeit at a higher than recommended retail price, but no surprises there. That said, at around $450 it's cheaper than a used 5700 XT or an Nvidia GTX 1080 Ti, both of which offer very similar performance. It's still overpriced, but it's less overpriced than alternative options. Shout out to any 1080 Ti owners, by the way, out there who bought one on launch day at MSRP, or even bought one a couple of years ago when the prices bottomed out on the used market. That was a seriously sound investment. In reference to the video's title, you have to laugh at the state of the current GPU market, or else you might just cry. Before you decide which of those to follow through with, let's review this card, keeping in mind its unintentionally competitive position on the market. The version I went with was the MSI Gaming X edition, which was the cheapest out of the variants I could find in stock. It's a great looking card that feels pretty weighty, and considering I've only ever had decent experiences with MSI products, well, I assume that's not going to be any different here. It's clocked higher than reference specs, has a small touch of RGB, and the fans automatically switch off under low GPU temperatures. Speaking of which, it idles at 32 degrees. So a couple of things before we actually discuss the benchmark results. Now this card supports PCI Express 4.0, but it's reduced to X8 bandwidth, so if you're using it in a system that doesn't support PCI Express 4.0, like a PCI Express 3.0 machine like I'm using today, then you may see a slight performance decrease when compared to this card running in a PCI Express 4.0 motherboard with a supported CPU. Now, I think, to be honest, that this situation is more representative of what most people would be running the card with. That's why I'm running it with my i5-10400F in a PCI Express 3.0 motherboard, but bear in mind that in some games there will be a larger performance difference than in others due to this strange limitation. So yeah, I don't really know why this is the case with this card, but it shouldn't affect things too significantly in the majority of titles, but at least not at this point in time. Anyway, to kick off our results then, Call of Duty Cold War, Black Ops Cold War, almost forgot the name of the game then, runs fine, high settings, 1080p, everything is set to high and everything else is set to enabled. All of the options that have an enabled or disabled toggle have been set to enabled, and as you can see, over 150 frames per second a lot of the time, or let's say over 100 FPS pretty much all of the time at this resolution. This is very much a 1080p or 1440p card, although at that high resolution it might struggle a little bit more. But not in the case with Call of Duty here. Here we are then at 1440p, the same settings are applied, high settings all round. I'm using the sniper here. I don't ever remember being this good with the sniper, but here we are. Yeah, so the game runs absolutely fine. Again, high settings, everything that can be enabled has been, except for ray tracing. Now we're going to get onto that very briefly in the next gameplay footage, which will be Crysis Remastered, but with a card like this I don't think ray tracing is worth it, to be honest. I usually like to enable ray tracing with cards that I know aren't hindered too much when enabling it. The 3070, for example, I could put ray tracing on with that because I knew that it would still comfortably play games even with those options enabled, but with a card like the 6600 XT, the small visual differences and the gimmick of ray tracing to me just isn't worth it in terms of the performance that you're going to be sacrificing. But let's move on to Crysis Remastered and I'll discuss this a little more. So here we are then, Crysis Remastered with ray tracing off. First of all, this is 1080p with the high preset. Basically everything has just been set to high under the graphical quality options. The frame rate is pretty decent here. There will be moments when the game shoots above 100 FPS, but it's very rare that it'll drop below 60 with these settings. If we look at the temperature of the card, it doesn't really exceed 60-65 degrees, which is quite impressive, and it doesn't get too loud either. Overall, Crysis Remastered runs pretty well, to be honest, with these settings. You could probably crank things up a little higher, but the difference between high and very high, for example, is pretty minimal in terms of visual gain, so I'd recommend sticking with high, to be fair. What I'm going to do now is switch ray tracing on, and you can see the difference between performance, and you'll probably also notice that in terms of visuals, well, there isn't really much of an improvement at all. So here we are, same scenario, starting off as this truck is firing on us here. The frame rate is already hovering at around 60 FPS. There are a lot more dips, 59 FPS now. There will be occasions again when the game does shoot above 70-80 frames per second, but I don't think it's really worth it at all. Ray tracing, that is, in terms of the loss of performance. So yeah, although you do notice a few fancier reflections and lighting effects and things like that, it just doesn't seem to be worth it for me, especially now as the frame rate starts to dip to the mid-50s. Yeah, there's a few more little stutters here and there as well. The frame times are more affected, 47 FPS there, so in my opinion, it's not really worth it. I'm going to move on to 1440p, and hopefully, with ray tracing off, we should still see at least 60 frames per second. So here we are with 1440p resolution now. The same high settings are enabled. Here the frame rate is going to shoot up past 70 or 80 FPS on occasion. The game is more than playable, and to be honest, it looks really, really good. Crysis Remastered looks good even at low, to be fair. So yeah, and I'm not sure how many of you still play this, but I always like to test it because to me it still represents both a visual and sort of performance benchmark, much like the old version of the game. Alright, so Cyberpunk 2077. Now here I was using the high preset. Once again, we've got high crowd density and high textures enabled as well. Cyberpunk's a game that, no matter what you think of it, you can't argue that it looks really good. There's something about Night City, the vibrancy of it and the graphical quality that really stands out. And here, yeah, we're getting pretty decent performance. I'm just going to start causing carnage here to see how things drop. Let's take out the trusty shotgun. Oh. The police are on us straight away. There we go, just wipe him out there. The frame rate's still remaining pretty stable. Okay, where to next? I think we're going to see if we can take this car. Can we take this car? Yes, let's get in. Sorry, mate. Right, yeah, it's pretty good average, pretty good 1 and 0.1% figures as well. The frame rate's dropping more towards 70 there, but it doesn't drop below 60 in terms of an average, so overall performance is pretty good, and Night City really does look good with these graphical settings. I'm going to switch to 1440p again and see what happens when we try and keep the settings the same. Alright, so yeah, if we try and stick with the high settings, 1440p, come on, get on the motorbike. I have some really weird issues with the motorbike, like driving it after the last patch. It sort of doesn't move for a while until you go into reverse, but I guess that's just another bug of Cyberpunk, to be honest. 47, 48 FPS seems to be what I'm getting most of the time. The game does look a little better at 1440p, but to be honest, trying to play it with the high settings and this card really isn't worth it in terms of the performance sacrifice. So what I'm going to do now is switch to 1440p at low and see if we can still hit that 60 FPS target instead. There was another update this morning. I'm still running on 1.3. I'm not sure if the update changed the game version this morning and whether or not performance has changed, but yeah, if we drop things down to medium here, there you go. See, 60 frames per second is easily doable now, and to be honest, visually it doesn't look that different than high. So if you have a 6600 XT or you plan on getting one for whatever reason, then yeah, 1080p or 1440p with medium settings is probably your best bet, or 1080p high, of course. Okay, so Days Gone is probably one of the most optimized games that's come out in the last year or so. Now I've absolutely cranked the settings right up here. We're running on very high. This is the very high preset. I'm not usually a fan of very high presets. I think the difference in a lot of games between high and very high or ultra doesn't really warrant the performance dip that you see, but in a situation like this where you're going to be seeing at least 60 frames per second anyway, well, you may as well just use the very high settings. Now this is a pretty early mission in the game, but it's actually quite demanding. As you venture into the forest or more open areas, you'll see the frame rate increase even more. Once again, the temperature of the card doesn't really exceed 60 degrees, and it doesn't get too loud either. The i5-10400F, by the way, is still chugging along very happily as well, and I'm pretty pleased with this purchase. Days Gone at 1440p also runs with at least 60 frames per second, and we don't need to change the visual quality preset here either. In Cyberpunk we had to turn things down a bit, but here we're still seeing at least 60 FPS, though there may be a few more dips here and there. Let's just sneak into this building and see what supplies we can find. Actually no, we'll go up here first because we still have an enemy. Quickly take care of those. The frame rate will drop below 60 on occasion, but for the most part, it's going to be a very smooth experience, even at 1440p. Now, I don't think that the 6600 is a 4K card at all. It will be capable of it, and I'm sure it will be capable of it at 60 FPS in some games, but it's best suited to 1080 or 1440 as far as I'm concerned. Let's just make our way around here. Yes, there's an enemy there. Let's take them out and make our way to the roof. As you can see, the frame rate's still holding pretty steady. The card is a little bit hotter, but still not exceeding 60 degrees. Let's move on to our next title then, and see what else this can do. So in Fortnite, I was actually quite surprised at how bad the performance was. Not necessarily bad, because you can see that we're still getting a decent 120 plus FPS average, but the stutter was really quite significant here. This is with the medium settings, because high was even more of a problem, but you may be able to pick it up on the frame time graph. There are little spikes here and there. This represents stutter in the game. It's not too off-putting, but it is quite bad, and I'm not really sure why this is happening. I'm not sure if it's the AMD drivers or just a game update, but things are actually a little better at 1440p. Yeah, so at 1440p, the average frame rate was still pretty good. It didn't seem too different, actually, gameplay-wise, but the stutter was reduced here at this high resolution. So, yeah, I'm not quite sure what's up with Fortnite. It doesn't run as well as I thought it would. I'm not sure if this has always been the case for AMD cards anyway. Has it run worse on AMD cards in the past? But, yeah, it's not a brilliant experience overall, and I'd probably recommend actually turning the settings down a little bit more if you're concerned with these frame dips, although they can't seem to be avoided. This sort of happens no matter the setting that you're using, but at 1440p here they are somewhat reduced. So with a card like this, yeah, 2560 by 1440 seems to be the much better way to play. So with GTA 5 coming to next gen consoles again, the re-release of GTA 5, it's still very much relevant, I feel. And you'll be pleased to know that on this card we can run the game absolutely maxed out, apart from MSAA with at least 60 frames per second. I'm using the highest possible in-game settings. Everything is turned up to very high or ultra, and the advanced settings, you know, such as the distance scaling and the shadows, are all turned right up to their absolute highest as well. I did briefly turn on MSAA and the MSAA reflections, I think they're called, but yeah, that caused some serious frame dips. So this game can be pretty demanding if you crank things right up, but here, just with FXAA on and everything else turned up to very high, you're not going to have a problem with GTA 5 at 1080p. Again, no problems at 1440p, you're getting an overall sharper image quality here, and not really sacrificing too much in terms of the frame rate. The frame times, the 1.1% lows, are also pretty decent. There's no real stutter to report here. GTA 5 will run fairly well on this card at 1440p with the highest in-game settings. As you can see there, the frame rate did dip towards 70, but it never gets below 60, to be honest. So yeah, overall, it's a pretty smooth experience here. Okay, so here we are above London with Microsoft Flight Simulator. This is the high-end settings preset here, so everything looks really good, and we were still seeing at least 60 frames per second. I was worried about this one because it is a very demanding game, though it did get a recent update that really improved things. It improved sort of CPU utilization as well, from what I saw. But here, yeah, 60 frames per second with the high-end preset is definitely possible, and the game, I'm sure you'll agree, looks absolutely fantastic. So There's not much else to say here. The busier the area, the lower the frame rate. If you're flying over nothing, over a field somewhere, then yeah, it's going to be even better than this. But even in a busy city like London, you're not going to have too much of a problem with the frame rate dropping below 60. Now at 1440p, I've accidentally cut the engine here. I don't know what's happened. I can't restart the plane. I've stalled, so I'm just going to land somewhere, possibly in the river. But yeah, 50 FPS, not quite 60 with the high-end preset at 1440p. The game certainly looks a little bit sharper. It does look a bit better. I do not know what has happened to my plane. I've got no power. We're going to drop things to medium in a moment then and see how this improves things. Yeah, so this is the medium preset with TAA enabled by default. Nothing else has been changed. And as you can see, even in London, once again, we are seeing 60 FPS as an average. My plane is still going down. I don't know what's happened here. But yeah, it's a pretty playable and decent experience all round with Microsoft Flight Simulator and the 6600 XT from MSI. For the final test then, this is Red Dead Redemption 2 with Digital Foundry's console quality settings. I cannot remember where I found these settings. I think it was from one of their videos or on Reddit. But yeah, what you're getting here is essentially how the game looks on console, for example, the PS4 or Xbox One X. Of course, we are getting a better frame rate than we would with those consoles, over 100 FPS, even in the busy town of Valentine. The game looks really good, even with these settings that use a mixture of ultra, high, medium, and low, to be honest. But yeah, we could certainly turn things up a little higher and still hit 60 plus FPS. But I always sort of choose the console settings by default because I think you get a perfect balance of visual quality and performance, which is always nice to see. So I'm going to turn things up now to 1440p with the same settings and see what happens. Just as expected here, yeah, there's not much of a problem here. We're still seeing plus 60 FPS. In fact, 70 or 80 isn't too much to expect, even in the town of Valentine once again. The game looks a little sharper, a little better at 1440p. And we're not sacrificing too much performance-wise. Let's just take a ride round the town here. I think let's see if we can take his horse. Okay, not the quickest robbery in the world, but there we go. Yeah, so overall, the 6600 XT is an okay card that's just priced wrong, but that's the same as everything right now. I think if it was priced cheaper, then it wouldn't be as available as it is. You know, its current pricing is high, but if it was even lower, then it would just be another sold out card. So yeah, I'm in two minds about the pricing. Of course, primarily I think it is too expensive, but if it was sitting on shelves at £200-300, it wouldn't be in stock for very long. So yeah, if you want a card right now that's good for 1080p gaming, either keep the card that you've got or just it's so hard to say by one of these. It's just what a mess the market's in. That's been the 6600 XT review though. I reviewed it because there's literally nothing to review at the moment. I want some lower end cards coming in at around the £150, £200 or dollar or euro price point, but it's probably going to be a while. So as for this one, well, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, leave a like, leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.